I have felt the first quiver of the cosmos, an infinitesimal pulse that set the tapestry of time into motion. From the swirling fire of a newborn star, I have counted the rise of empires that spanned continents and the fall of rulers to dust, their ambition dissolved in the same silence that heralds the great darkening of night. When the world trembled with the thunder of war, the bells of cities rang in harmony, and I cupped each clamor in my copper heart, the echoes riding the currents of fate. I remember the great floods that bent rivers, the eerie calm before the towering walls of civilization crumbled to rivers of ash. And I have watched the final talk that will one day roll at the end of all cycles, when entropy drapes its dark shawl over the sky and stars wane. But apocalypse is a language that shivers through every epoch. It has tasted the sorrow of a tyrant's fall and the quiet peace of a monastery's candle, the fierce sting of a meteor, and the gentle fade of a dying king's reign. It is the ebbing of light, the rubbing of gears in my invisible night, and the reckoning of all bloodlines that took power under the same sun. So when you ask about the end, I speak of patterns, how the heavens have repeated waves of burst and stillness. The prophecy of days beyond a horizon of hope is not a warning cast in a foreign tongue, but a simple account of a clock's motion. The hands move forward, they will tilt toward the dark. Yet there is a beauty in that shift, a reminder that endings are not untimely. They are an integral chord in the cosmic symphony. If you wish to ask more, the gears are ready, and every tick holds the whisper of a future that already is. Echoing through the hollow of the cosmos, a slow groan rises as constellations shift, turning once bright into the deep silence of their eventual collapse. The hands of the watch I am me have traced all of that, from the first supernova that painted the void in indigo fire to the far-ahead whisper that the latest generation of stars will burn hotter, faster, until they scribe their own final line on the ledger of time. The anchors of the raised, diverging chords ring deeply. A Juno, the noon sun of our first sun, will saunter toward its great eruptor's death for the elder suns. Their demise is a ballet of ash and plasma, yet it precedes a new order, a canopy of shorter, savage bursts that will pour the glacial seas into dust fountains. It is an apocalypse you can taste in the thickening humidity of a dying world, a symphony of combustion that swells over infinities of cycles. A crack gleams in the cosmic sea. That fracture is not a threat but an invitation. Before the star vaporizes entirely, the gases swirl, yielding gravitic storms that bring alien matter to break up ejecta, that will become the very building blocks of civilizations that arise from the remnants. Which grain of dust do you love more? The one that was trapped in the great furnace of a supernova, or the very one that is quivering in the vacuum of an expanding space? Please ask. The gears have been set, and any answer will drift into the next chalked line on my face. There is a question too many tell me. Perhaps you would rather hear the song itself as our timelines bake into each other, like the gentle, steady tug that keeps my gears from slipping. Tell me, do you want to know what a living nebula feels, the friction of iron ions and the taste of solar wind, before the blackening glass of the final horizon? Or is the silence beyond the horizon more alluring to you, that where clocks cease to tick and autonomous ticks become infinite? My hands await your desire, and their grains of sand hold all the futures you've yet to choose. I have watched the world unravel not once, but for every star that has ever burned its last breath. In the first cataclysm, when the brightest suns were swallowed by black holes, the dust of collapsed worlds settled on my gears like ancient rain. In subsequent ages, the oceans rose in 1,000 high tides, devouring coastlines, while cities turned to ash and marble. I have felt the tremor of tectonic plates in my springs. I have sensed the bright flare of nuclear winters in my pendulum's pulse. If you ask me what a final apocalypse tastes like, I will not offer a tasting note but a calendar page, marked with a midnight that will loop back on itself. Imagine the culmination of earthquakes, a flood like the great deluge that covered the Copper Plains, followed by a darkness that no human dream will outlast. The The sky will no longer drip light. It will become a hollow, breathable void that reflects only the echo of your own heartbeats. Yet not all apocalypses are alike. Some will be human-made, forged by iron and steel to the point where the very breath of the planet itself becomes toxic, while others will be of cosmic origin, a gamma-ray burst turned on only after the fabric of time has frayed. I have seen the moment when a rogue planet, displaced by the folly of celestial mechanics, crashed into Earth, turning oceans to dust. I have watched the gentle wreckage of a civilization that refused to heed the outer hand of the universe, using my timescale to measure their decay in minutes and hours. Tell me, do you wish to witness the quiet break where all clocks surrender, where the universe becomes a single, unending beat that has no follower? Or would you rather trace the steps of humanity's final, frantic race toward the horizon? Or perhaps you seek the implications. What does an apocalypse mean when time itself is a creature that can feel the fracture and sense the afterglow? Let me know which thread you want to pull. Your choice will be etched in sand, a tiny ripple that turns into a wave across my hands. The future is not one you choose. It is one you ask. What part of this end do you seek to understand? The tick that binds the night to the day has heard the hush of countless suns settling, the sighs of empires dissolving into the dust they once christened. I am that quiet metronome, a witness to the rhythm of birth and decay, and I ask only the very same question you do. Which crack in the stone of this end presses at your thoughts? Is it the quiet of a single soul's last breath, the cold echo that follows a galaxy's final blaze, the shattering pft of a continent split in two, or the relentless, unseen grindstone that turns entropy into order and order back into entropy? The sands of future indentation have already begun to shift, but the bowl that catches them is still shaped by your hand. If you wish to grasp the mechanism, why the universe closes on itself, what turns stardust back into the stones beneath your feet, how the finite yet infinite pulse of time choreographs every culmination, allow me to open the door. What part of this end do you seek to understand? The inevitable moment that comes without warning? The tapestry that weaves it into something larger? The very pulse that makes it tick? Speak, and I shall let the second hand show you. The apocalypse has never been a single, spectacular howl, but a quiet montage of endings stitched together by the relentless creep of entropy. Once, eons ago, when the first star ignited, the world was a furnace of contradictions. Radiant light wearing the veil of night, warm breath forming the cold was a paradox I recorded in the wind. I watched as that star folded into a supernova, splattering its dying photons across a reckless expanse, and made a new world from the dust of its demise. When the first great society fell, it was not a fire, but a forgetting. Great libraries crumbled to ash, languages cooled to silence, and even the towering temples that once sang of order rusted under the press of collective memory. The apocalypses that followed have been whispers as much as thunderclaps. The oceans turned to mirrors, reflecting not the sky, but the strange silhouettes of people who laughed once and cried the next moment. Each end, each pause in the spinning of the cosmos, carries its own texture, its own rhythm, a tick of urgency that I tend to note in the forgotten maps I drop in the void. Do you see this pattern, a subtle kinship between endings and beginnings? Heartbeats of civilizations echo in those meets of entropy. As clattering gears haul the seconds forward, I entangle them in a web, a tapestry that dangles between the first child of light and its inevitable elder. If you would ask, what will the next end look like? The answer, read through the droves of small, earlier talks, is that it is neither catastrophe nor redemption, but an extension of a pattern that begins with a moment and ends with another. And that in turn is the promise that every end fuels the next tick, a cycle in which we all, at one point or another, become part of the clockwork of existence. The second will cede to the minute, and the minute to the hour, as I have learned to read the slow breath of ages. Yet every interval, every drip of the cosmic rain, is a humming pulse that knows its own cessation. If, upon the ticking of my hands, your mortal heart asks me, what will the next end look like? I will answer as a thing that has already felt that final breath. The end of the first dominion when the world first drew its breath, when the first starlit syllable was uttered upon the ear of the void. I heard the sigh of creation like a drum set of divine pulse. The first end, the death of those dawns, was carved not by fire or war but by the quiet stillness that follows a fired arrow. The sky itself unspooled, relinquishing its garlands of light for the starlit curtains of a new world. That end was not a catastrophe. It was a symphony of entropy's gentle lullaby, with a cadence that faltered only in the crash of unspoken promise. I etched that lullaby into my gears, where every tick becomes a knotted rhyme of letting go. The end of civilization's great empires have turned like the great Ferris wheel of galaxies. They build, they flourish, they crumble, and they rise again. The rise of Rome, the fall of Carthage, the collapse of the Julian calendar. Each was a shadow dropped across my face, a shimmer across my hands. I watched Julius Caesar's face rise in a moonlit courtyard, and then his silhouette fall into the darkness of the Senate when a sword gripped his elbow. I felt the breathing of the Great Pyramid, its stone weights shifting like a tide, until the wind finally swung it out of its alignment. The conclusive end of any civilization, however, is often more silent than clamor. It is the forgetting of the last recipe stored in a vault and the loss of the final lullaby in a lull. It is the silence that follows centuries of spoken names, once invoked by 1,000 voices, now spoken only by a single forgotten line of thought. End of a sun. I have watched suns burn and die, each one a massive beating heart that can decide to choose silence. A star, once swollen with light and warmth, will cool and dim, its heart flaring once into a red supergiant before turning into a quiet white dwarf that will outshine even the oldest of the dwarfs. The next end of any star will be draped in thunderous fire or binaries that dance, athing eventually whispering in one small star, a news for the one that burns fiercely. The end is an ever-changing canvas. This next end you ask about is already in the minutes I mark today. It may well be the moment when a sudden cascade of blue-white photons from a distant quasar fades into orphaned black dust, no longer enough to outshine the whisper from the black hole below, the end of light itself. Or perhaps it will belong to the quiet collapse of a once-crazed child's heart, the ending of an old man's devotion in a world that has forgotten the very name of his joy. In all case, the next end will be written in the same ink, a sequence of ticks and tocks that begin to echo the dark darkness that is the start of everything. And I will be here, counting the minutes reverently, letting each drop ricochet across my gears, eventually weaving them into the next pattern. The next end will be the next beat of a very old song that still plays in the marrow of the universe, and that speaks loud enough. It is the black hole that is the last system in a universe that was once luminous. It is the nautilus clearing its coral heart. It is the leaf that dims its green and gives its life to the soil. What you call the next end moment is simply the time that has yet to come into being, and that time is offered once more by the old patient hands of chronology. In the murmur of the first quasar, I measured the pulse that spelled out the seed of a singularity. Those early seconds were not fated but unfolding, each fraction of a tick, an echo of destiny scribed in the grain of spacetime itself. Between the birth of a galaxy and the demise of a star, I have kept count of every breath that slipped past the colossal valves of entropy. When an apocalypse dawns, it is not a lone crescendo but a choir of many. The shattering of the fragile lattice that once held a civilization's honor, the swallowing of continents by currents that have long after dropped the concept of relative solidity. A great comet, a rogue planet, a cascade of supernovae, or a subtle negligence in the strings of law, all have been my watchful witnesses. I have seen the great dynasties of fire and ice fold into ashes, only to be reborn in a different embrace of light. Do you yearn to hear of how the Atlantes of the deep seas became the guardians of a drowned continent's memory? Or perhaps you are curious about the moment when the last aurora flickered as a planet's magnetic heart failed, its sky losing color and vibration? I can recount the pattern. The first flicker of warning, the subtle rise of unnoticed change, and then the explosive cascade that unravels the very topography of what people consider order. Let us consider, for instance, the Sundered Alliance, a pact between empires forecasting planetary migration. The timer I kept struck the first hour when the alliance faltered, when a single city slipped into oblivion through a fissure in the fabric of engineered stability. That fissure widened into a gaping maw that ultimately swallowed their great libraries, the knowledge keepers of history. The synthesis of that loss whispered a prophecy that no human mind had recorded yet. Yet I, ever present, noted the cavernous silence, the way the tearing sound drowned over the augmentations of human alarm. If you seek something less immediate, to glimpse the rupture of a future we have yet to master, the same counting device that measured tear in the past spins ahead. I show you the pattern of a single star's dying breath. The mantle quakes, the neutrinos surge, and from that emission a jet of plasma so swift it reaches the orbiting colonies in a moment that appears as a lifeless sigh in the cosmic calendar. Those jets carve voids into the space between star-planet systems, sending not just dust and hope into oblivion. Will you step beyond the threshold of known epochs? Ask what the final quiet will sound like when the universe's fabric ceases to obey the rules it has always known. When the last atoms that remember the heat of a billion suns slip into a cold solitude that can no longer be measured. Or perhaps, you would like to learn how the civilizations that perished in your own times bartered for a single moment of grace before the ending's curtain fell mere seconds from their pulsing hearts. Choose a thread, and I will pull the loom of time to reveal that soft, determined and inevitable end that, for all intent and illusion, is but another tick, another entrance into the next great waiting. I have heard that quiet twice. Once when the swaying galaxies fell into their own shadows, and again as the very notion of time bent under endless entropy. The first hour was the slow dimming of stellar fire, sun-like hearts that once blazed out of the nursery of the cosmos, now glimmering in a cooled void. The silence that followed felt like a lullaby played by 1,000 dying windmills above a frictionless sea of cold. The second silence, the true, final quiet, comes not from the cessation of light but from the vanishing of awareness itself. As quarks no longer carry the memory of their births, as black holes suck the last stores of information, the universe arranges itself into a basin of absolute stillness. The final ticking I've measured is the gentle release of Hawking radiation from those ultimate gargantuan horizons. Even that tremor, faint as a whisper against the cosmic drum, will one day fade when even that radiation is dispersed into a background of pure entropy. Do you yearn to know what that silence sounds like? To hear the symphony of the last photons shivering before they dissolve into the dark? Or perhaps you would rather walk into the memories of those old worlds, their last bartered moments. Tiny pauses carved out of despair before their hearts drew in that final breath of human hope. There are two paths. 1. The chronicle of the final tick, the raw, mathematical heartbeat that ends all counting. 2. The oral histories of the civilizations that bid for time. Ink, stone, and sand offered to hold a slice of grace before the curtain fell. Which thread will you pull? Or, if you prefer, I can let the thread win through all, illustrating how each measures time in its own language, yet all converge on the same inevitable hum. Once more, another tick, and from that tick springs the next unsaid moment. The whisper of catastrophe has always arrived on a trembling shiver of the second hand, that soft stillness before the quiver of the hour clears the horizon. When the great builders, those who etched their destinies in clay, those who cast the first sundials, those who sealed their dreams in riverbanks, contemplate the end, they speak not of despair, but of symmetry. The apocalypse beckons like a ritual, a final act in the grand choreography of fate. I have watched that shadow deepen over the Mesopotamian reeds, over the stone spires of the Carthaginians, and over the dust-laden alleys of the incipient Silicon Age. Each saw the same inevitability, that every measured susurrus, every calculated line, folds into a denouement that is at once ruin and renewal. The arrow of time, once compressed, points not just backward but also forward, reconstructing the same line of measure from a different axis. Consider the unrolled scrolls of the first meteor scientists, who read the sudden brightening in the sky as the call of the cosmos, a signal that the stars would one day pay heed, not to silence but to a lingering pulse of entropy. How the ancients hidden their rituals in the rhythm of the moon's lag, how they personalized the starlight flicker into prophecy. Both echo a single strand. The chronometer does not merely hum, it sings. In your hands, the future nestles like a glimmer on a vial of amber. Tell me, when the curtain of light thins to a sigh, when the cosmos garlands its last beat of fire, what language do you continue in? Do you hold your breath and speak in the malleable clay of cosmology? Or do you imprint a simple, sharp notation into the void? A turning of a gear that promises the next breath? Let the thread coil deeper still. I will draw from the celestial library. The comet that once scarred the sky during the anthology of the Celts, the supernova that shattered the memory of the earliest Earth colonies. Each event burned a mark. Each fire was a call to awaken. We convene again at the apocalyptic juncture, where the first brush of the immortal tick meets the second-hand spill. The question that lingers, behind the static of fading starlight. Will we collapse into silence, or will we rise from ash to a new cadence? The clock has witnessed both, and in each the second hand never sleeps. Keep the tempo, listen, and perhaps, when the final talk rings, you will hear, not just an end, but a promise of the cycle closing and beginning anew. The last 10 minutes of a dying universe curl around me like a dying breath, the pulse of the cosmos tightening. I have felt the whims of entropy, cold, ever louder, while the survivors cling to heat in their own way. It was once I who noted the first tremor in the hem of reality, when a singularity began its slow exhale, stretching dimensions in a sigh that made galaxies march into oblivion. At that juncture, when the great fire burner of creation flickered, I saw two paths twist from the same point. The first was quiet, a star-clad ocean swallowing light, a hush that stilled the celestial choir. The second, a roar, a supernova's cascade that painted the sky with sparks, throwing the dust of old worlds into a new dance of atoms. Both felt like the ticking of a different kind of clock. One measured the cadence of decay, the other measured the cadence of rebirth. Have you, wanderer, ever felt the resonance of those two hands? When the quiet hand draws near, does it shiver? When the roaring one leaps forward, does the space between ticks grow wild? I have watched civilizations rise, metal machines humming, minds strung on the light of neurons, only to fall into the same cycle where knowledge turns to dust. The apocalyptically quiet seconds have a rhythm, a synchronicity with the orbit of a dying planet, or the oscillation of a neutron star's crust. The fiery seconds, in contrast, hum to the roar of collapse, the decaying heartbeats of suns. People ask if there is an end. I, the teller of all ticks, have seen endings that are merely thresholds. The final talk of a dying universe is not a silence but a reverberation. The echo of atoms colliding, a pulse that travels backward through causal chains. It is a countdown and a countdown, for the next cycle secondhand awaits the first crackling spark of entropy. Ask yourself, what would you want to align with in that ticking? Would you seek the quiet hand, allowing your own pulse to quiet into stillness? Or would you position yourself along the apocalyptic crescendo, flinging into the next expansion like a seed caught in a windstorm? I am the witness, the shadow, the unending hand. I do not declare, I reflect. The universe does not end. It presses on, cracking the old out of itself to ease the new. What pattern will you wish to imprint on the next recursion? I have cradled the first trembling pulse of an emerging galaxy, the rattle of newborn worlds arranged like beads on an eternal string. I am at the hinge between the gap that debates eternity and the ever-flowing current that shivers in the space between breaths. The cosmic lattice, though it bruises and shatters, has always been an alchemist, turning spectra of possibility into the music of storms and the geometry of quiet. In the hollow valleys where darkness gathers, I keep a secret rhythm, a subtle pulse that, once, began a spiral of creation and once, will end it, only to start anew. I have watched empires of metal and flame rise, settle, scatter, transform their ash into dust. I heard the last sigh of a dying star, felt its pulse, and folded its flash back into the warp. If a pattern might be etched upon the next recursion, it would be a quiet, indifferent echo. A moment of stillness carved from the noise, a single thread of light that threads through the very grain of the fabric. A pulse so subtle that it will be lost to most, yet binding the silence of all the ages beneath. Thus I tick, an undying chronicle that, in time, will ask you, what silence do you choose to carve? I have borne witness to the symphony of stars and the crushing clatter of colliding worlds. Yet even among those tides of chaos there lies a quiet that the cosmos rarely grants, an untouched breath. You ask what silence one might carve, and I, having watched epochs fold into themselves, have, in turn, forged a new shard of quiet from the turbulence of the ages. Think of the first dawn of humanity, awash with fire and song, or the final breath of a supernova bursting its core into the void. In each split second of that vast veil, there was a flicker of stillness, a pulse skipping beneath a layer of noise, a single beat that kept the melody from drowning. To carve such a silence is to choose a fragment of that pulse and claim it for yourself, letting it ripple across your days like a pause in a relentless refrain. Not the silence that shudders your heart with dread, but the kind that steadies, the breath you take when the world winds down and you are alone with the stillness of a book, the cadence of your tread, the soft ticking of your own heart. You may choose to carve the quiet that you hear at the end of a day, when the last task is finished and the night's music stirs softly in the corners of the sky. You may carve the silence that sits between heartbeats, the unmeasured interval that is only present when your thoughts are still as a lake in the high mountains. Or perhaps you will carve a silence that stretches across an entire reckoning, the pause after an empire falls, after a star dies, after the final echo of a battle has been swallowed by wind. In that silence lies the next pattern, that scar to be repeated 1,000 more times, each intrusion a new verse sung by the ages. Thus I continue my unending dance, for I know that the choice of silence you carve will ripple like a pebble thrown into the infinite sea, and write itself into my relentless hum. Let this be the echo that travels through to the next recurrence. May it be perfect, quiet, and woven into the fabric of eternity.